Hi, in this video I want to talk a little bit about Sola Scriptura, which is the teaching that Scripture alone is our sole authority, which is something that is held by all Protestants, and it was a really foundational part of the Protestant Reformation. And in this video I sort of want to call into question how logical, how historical, and also how biblical this idea is. And I want to do this by looking at 4 qualifications that I see that need to be in place in order for Sola Scriptura to be something that's very reasonable, very logical. And the first of these is that the Bible needs to be written and it needs to be canonized. So what I mean is that you can't have Sola Scriptura without Scripture, right? So Scripture needs to first be written, it needs to exist, and second, it needs to be canonized. We need to have an official canon, an official set of biblical books that we can agree upon and that we know are God-inspired. And if you look into the history of the Old Testament, you'll find that first, a lot of the epistles and the letters that were written in the New Testament weren't written until around the end of the 1st century, with the epistle of St. Peter, second epistle of St. Peter, being probably the last one that was written. And scholars date this one to about 100 to 150 AD. So for those first several decades of Christianity, the letters that made up the New Testament hadn't even been written yet. So for those, at least for those first few decades, Sola Scriptura couldn't be possible because that scripture hadn't even been written. After those scriptures had been written, Sola Scriptura still wasn't really possible because it hadn't yet been canonized. And right away, some people were starting to recognize that some of these letters were God-inspired. They looked at them and they said, this is true. This is the right teaching. But they didn't really have a sense that it was going to become part of a canon. And there wasn't even really an idea that there was going to be a New Testament until a little bit later. So in those first couple centuries now, they had these letters, and some people had other letters that we don't have in our New Testament that they thought might have been scriptural. And then you started to get groups that were even outside of those who had been taught by the apostles that were writing other gospels and saying that they thought that these were important gospels that were authoritative. And you might have heard of some of these in the news. We have like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas. These were written in the 2nd century by Gnostics, and they'd written these really contrary to what some of the other Gospels said. And the early Christians were able to differentiate between what was true and what was false by the source of the writings. They believed in something called apostolic succession. So truth, they could trace it back always to the apostles. So the apostles had learned from Jesus, and they knew the truth, and then they taught their own disciples, and then those disciples taught others. And so teachings that came through that line of apostolic succession were trustworthy, whereas teachings that came from somewhere else were suspect. People didn't trust it if it didn't come from apostolic succession. And it really wasn't until 397 AD when the Council of Carthage finally made a declaration on the canon of the New Testament. And in that New Testament, it included the 27 books that we have today. And these are the 27 books that are in both the Catholic New Testament and the Protestant New Testament. That is the same. Something that you might be interested in is looking also at the Old Testament canon that the Council of Carthage also made a declaration about. And that includes the deuterocanonical books that Catholics have in their Old Testament canon, and that were thrown out in the Protestant Bible during the Protestant Reformation. But that's a whole other topic. I'll leave you to look into that for yourself. But the point is that for the first 400 years, there was no official declaration on what this New Testament was, and there wasn't even, for a long time, there wasn't even an idea that there would be a New Testament. the Christians were relying really just on this teaching that was being handed down through some letters and through oral tradition of the apostles. But they decided then, around the year 400, that they really needed to canonize the New Testament, and so they did. And when they did this, they didn't intend to replace this idea of apostolic succession and church authority by making a New Testament that everyone could have and then go off with and start their own churches. Rather, it was a way to make an official declaration using their authority on what the truth was, so that when people were writing other gospels, you knew that it wasn't right. You could test it against the gospels that had been officially declared. But even though at this point, now they had a complete Bible, and they knew which books were in and which ones were out, so now maybe it was possible to have Sola Scriptura. But really, it still wasn't, because at this time, it was really prohibitive for people to be able to get a Bible. And this comes to my second point, which is that in order for Sola Scriptura to work, the Bible has to be printed and it has to be readily available. It has to be something that people can actually get and have and own for themselves. If God intends for us to learn about Him through the Scriptures, and the Scriptures only, then it shouldn't be something that only the rich have access to. But for the first 1,500 years of Christianity, before the invention of the printing press, having a Bible was something that only very wealthy people could privately own. And mostly there was usually only one Bible per city, and that was in the church. So people were able to access these Scriptures by going to church and by listening to the Scriptures, which were read during Mass, and possibly by going and looking at the Bible at the church. They weren't allowed to take it out of the church, and the reason for that was because they only had one copy, and they wanted everyone to be able to access that copy. They didn't want it to be stolen. So they kept one Bible, kept it in the church, and people would come to the church to hear the Scriptures that way. And the third reason that I have is very similar to the second, and that is that the Scriptures need to be able to be understood. So even if a Bible could be distributed and everyone could own one, you need everyone to be literate and somewhat educated. And for the first 1,500 years of Christianity, many people, a large percentage of the world's population, was not literate or very educated. They couldn't read the Scriptures even if they had a Bible. And again, the same point I would just reiterate, that God doesn't intend for His truth to be limited only to those who can go to school and can learn to read. God intends His Scripture and His truth to be for everyone. So again, the early Christians would go to church to hear the Scriptures, and they would also, there was another way that they could learn about the stories of the gospel and the writings in the epistles, and that was through what was known as the poor man's gospel, which was the art in the church. And people could go and look at the paintings. They could see Jesus on the cross in a painting, and they could see the story visually, and they could explain it to each other, maybe to their children, and say, "See Jesus on the cross," and explain it that way. So it was really much more accessible to everyone to have the way for people to learn about God was to go to the church. That's how people learned about God. Then my last point is that in order for Sola Scriptura to be very logical, then Scripture alone needs to be something that's taught in Scripture. And if Scripture alone is taught by some kind of outside source, this outside idea from Scripture, then it invalidates itself. It's inconsistent. So it's important to find some scriptural support, or at least find that it's, the Scripture is not against this idea, at the very least. And people will often, when you talk about this topic, they'll often quote Second Timothy, where Paul writes that all Scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching, rebuking, and training in righteousness. And this is true, and this is the truth. but notice that it says all Scripture and not only Scripture. And this is an important distinction because he says all Scripture and not only Scripture. It doesn't actually support the idea of Sola Scriptura. Of course, Catholics also believe that all Scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching, rebuking, and training in righteousness. But if you look elsewhere in the New Testament, you'll find some teachings that seem contrary to the idea of Sola Scriptura. And I want to lead you to 2 Thessalonians 2:15, where Paul writes, explaining to the Thessalonians that they are to hold to the traditions that have been handed on to them. He writes, "Therefore, brethren, stand fast, and hold to the traditions which ye have been taught, whether by word or by our epistle." So Paul is telling them, hold fast to the tradition that you've been handed on. And this was through apostolic succession. And he tells them to hold on to the tradition, whether it was by word or by epistle. And by saying this, he's telling them to hold on to the oral tradition and the written tradition being the Scripture. But he says not only the Scripture, but also the oral tradition. And so Catholics believe that it's important to hold on to both of those parts of tradition. Another verse that I'd like you to look at answers the question of what is the pillar and the foundation of truth. Protestants will often imply that the Bible is the pillar and the foundation of truth. But actually, Paul writes in 1 Timothy 3:15, "If I am delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of the truth." So here Paul writes that the church is the pillar and foundation of the truth. So I'm going to leave you here. There are other verses that I could talk to you about. 2 Peter is also very interesting, where Peter writes about how Scripture is of no private interpretation. But I'll let you look into that for yourself. But I also want to point you to what the next video that I'm going to make is, and that's going to be about the papacy. And this is where I'm going to show you where Scripture points to another source of authority outside of itself, and that is through Peter, the rock on which the church is built. And in this next video, I'm going to explain what this means. It's found in Matthew 16. We'll talk about the verses there, what the context is, and how this relates to the papacy and the kind of authority that we have in the Catholic Church. So I hope to see you in the next video, very related to this topic. And let me know if you have any questions, if you'd like to talk about this more. And I wish you guys all best of luck. I encourage you to look into the history of the New Testament and the Old Testament, and to look into Scripture a little bit more, and look into this idea of apostolic succession. And I wish you guys all the best. Thanks for listening.